For nearly a decade, Dr. Frank Tassone was the face of success in Long Island's prestigious Roslyn School District. With tailored suits, a polished smile, and a doctorate in education, he embodied everything parents expected from a leader entrusted with their children's futures. Under his leadership, Roslyn became one of New York's highest-ranked public school systems, its graduates flooding Ivy League campuses, its test scores topping state charts. Newspapers hailed Tassone as the man who made Roslyn shine. He was everywhere, shaking hands at PTA meetings, attending student plays, even personally calling parents to congratulate their children. He knew everyone's name, one teacher recalled. He made you feel the district was his family. And in many ways, it was. Tassone's influence extended to the smallest purchase orders, the largest budget approvals, and the very culture of the school board. To most, he was a visionary administrator. To auditors years later, he would appear as something far different, the architect of one of the most elaborate school embezzlement schemes in U.S. history. In the early 2000s, Roslyn was flush with money. Property taxes from the wealthy suburbs around Nassau County poured millions into the district coffers. Tassone oversaw every dollar. The board trusted him implicitly. Oversight meetings lasted minutes, rubber-stamping his budgets. When small discrepancies surfaced, he waved them away with calm authority, quoting statutes or policy clauses no one else fully understood. He was meticulous about image. He read the New York Times daily, taught a college ethics class at night, and often spoke about building moral citizens. His office walls displayed student essays about integrity. Beneath that veneer, though, he was quietly funneling funds through false invoices, travel reimbursements, and ghost employee checks, operations run with the help of his longtime assistant, Pamela Gluckin. Together, they created a labyrinth of doctored receipts and fake vendor accounts. Money meant for classrooms and textbooks was instead funding Tassone's luxury vacations, first-class flights, and a Manhattan apartment shared with his secret partner, a lifestyle financed by taxpayers who considered him a role model. Even as the fraud grew, his charm insulated him. Teachers adored him. Board members feared crossing him. Parents donated more, believing every dollar went to Roslyn's gold standard education. Nobody questioned how a public official on a modest salary could maintain a life that resembled a corporate executive's. The illusion of decency held until one small error broke it all. A district accountant noticed a $250,000 check made out to a vendor she didn't recognize. Her inquiry set off a chain reaction that would uncover over $11 million in stolen funds, shake New York's education system, and end the career of a man once hailed as the best superintendent in America. What investigators found next would read like fiction. Falsified ledgers, luxury purchases, disguised as curriculum materials, and years of systemic blind spots that let one man rewrite the ethics of an entire district. The first sign of collapse came quietly, an email from a mid-level auditor noting an unusual vendor payment. No one in the Roslyn School District's finance department recognized the name on the $250,000 check. At first, the superintendent, Frank Tassone, brushed it off. He was calm, even charming. A clerical error, he told them, probably tied to the technology fund, but the error refused to go away. The district's internal auditor began cross-checking invoices, uncovering hundreds of questionable charges, flights, home renovations, and luxury expenses, listed under vague categories like student enrichment and special instructional services. It was only when the receipts reached the New York State Comptroller's office that the illusion of Roslyn's perfection finally cracked. In 2004, investigators descended on the district offices. Tassone, once the darling of Nassau County, watched as agents carted away boxes of financial records, files that documented a scheme so intricate it bordered on corporate fraud. The total exceeded $11 million in stolen public funds, siphoned over nearly a decade. At the center was Tassone and his trusted business administrator, Pamela Gluckin. They had fabricated vendors, padded reimbursements, and redirected school checks to personal accounts. The stolen money funded trips to Las Vegas and Europe, cosmetic surgeries, home extensions, and even frequent flyer miles credited to Tassone's personal accounts. Parents who once applauded his leadership now crowded school board meetings demanding answers. One father stood up and shouted, "You taught our kids about integrity while stealing from their classrooms." The betrayal was complete moral, financial, and institutional. The press coverage was relentless. The New York Times described the scandal as the largest public school theft in American history. Newsday ran daily front-page updates. Tassone, who had built his reputation on trust, now stood accused of systematically dismantling it. When confronted, Tassone pleaded guilty to grand larceny, offering a false instrument for filing and conspiracy. He accepted full responsibility, but maintained that no child ever suffered from his crimes, a claim investigators dismissed as delusional. At his 2006 sentencing, he told the court, "I'm deeply sorry for betraying the district I loved." The judge's reply was cold. "You didn't just betray them, Dr. Tassone. You educated them in deceit." He received 4 to 12 years in prison, serving 3 before his release on good behavior. Gluckin also served time, while other district employees were disciplined for negligence. The fallout rippled beyond Roslyn. New York State enacted strict auditing reforms, including mandatory external reviews and spending transparency requirements for all school districts. What began as a suburban scandal became a nationwide lesson in oversight failure. In the years that followed, Roslyn rebuilt its reputation, but the story never disappeared. HBO's Bad Education dramatized the affair, with Hugh Jackman portraying Tassone's duality. The educator who believed his lies were justified. The thief who still saw himself as a role model. Frank Tassone died in 2022, living quietly under a new name. To the end, he insisted his intentions were never malicious. Yet in Roslyn's collective memory, his name remains synonymous with one truth. Even the institutions built on ethics can be corrupted by the charm of a single man who learns how to fake it perfectly. As one parent said years later, looking back at the scandal that shook an entire town, "He taught us the most expensive lesson a school can give, that trust once stolen can never be refunded."
Every week, we uncover cases that defies logic. Behind each episode are hours of research, scripting, and editing to make sure every detail you hear is true. What you're watching isn't entertainment. It's real documentary work that remembers the victims and exposes the silence around them. Hit subscribe. It's free for you, but it helps us keep investigating, narrating, and preserving the stories the world would rather erase.
When Barbara Byrd-Bennett took charge of Chicago Public Schools, CPS, in 2012, she was celebrated as a reformer, a veteran educator with decades of experience in Cleveland and Detroit. The city's leaders described her as a teacher's teacher, someone who understood both the classroom and the boardroom. Under her leadership, Chicago promised a renaissance in education. But behind the polished speeches and carefully staged press conferences, Byrd-Bennett was cultivating something else. A private partnership that would later be exposed as one of the most audacious education bribery scandals in U.S. history. It started with contracts. CPS was preparing to launch a major professional development initiative, partnering with companies that would train teachers in new learning strategies. One firm, Superintendent Academy, seemed perfectly positioned. It specialized in training school administrators and had close ties to Byrd-Bennett's previous work in Cleveland. What few knew was that Byrd-Bennett had already worked for Superintendent and her former bosses there, Gary Solomon and Thomas Vranas, were about to make her an offer that would blur the line between reform and racketeering. According to later court filings, Solomon and Vranas promised Byrd-Bennett kickbacks, totaling more than $2 million in return for steering CPS contracts their way. The arrangement was masked as consulting credits and future job opportunities phrases buried in private emails that would eventually become key evidence. In public, she sold the contracts as essential investments in leadership training. "We must prepare our educators for the 21st century," she told reporters, her voice calm, her confidence unshakable. CPS board members approved the deals, trusting her expertise. No one questioned why the same vendor kept winning multi-million-dollar bids without competitive review. Her emails, later unsealed by federal prosecutors, painted a different picture. In one exchange, Solomon joked that she had earned a bonus, a reference to the secret payments she would receive after leaving her CPS post. Byrd-Bennett responded with chilling nonchalance, "I have tuition to pay and grandbabies to feed." By 2014, CPS was under mounting financial strain, teachers were protesting budget cuts, and Byrd-Bennett's reform image began to crack. When federal investigators quietly opened a probe into procurement irregularities, her world began to collapse. On the surface, she kept smiling for cameras, attending ribbon cuttings, and speaking about equity and opportunity. But behind closed doors, the FBI had already begun collecting hard evidence email chains, payment records, and whistleblower testimonies. By the time her resignation came in 2015, it was too late to contain the fallout. Chicago's promise of a new era in education reform had become another headline about greed hiding behind good intentions. When the investigation finally went public, Barbara Byrd-Bennett's carefully constructed image crumbled overnight. The woman once hailed as Chicago's education reform hero now stood accused of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar bribery scheme. In October 2015, federal prosecutors unveiled a 23-count indictment detailing how Byrd-Bennett had accepted bribes and kickbacks from the Supers Academy executives Gary Solomon and Thomas Vranes in exchange for steering $23 million in training contracts their way. The documents were damning. The emails read like a playbook in corruption disguised as mentorship. Solomon wrote, "You're our girl. When you leave CPS, you've got a job and a payday waiting." Byrd-Bennett's reply was chillingly casual. "I have tuition to pay and grandbabies to feed." The supposed future employment was nothing more than a promise of $2.3 million in bribes, hidden through sham consulting arrangements. Federal investigators described it as a calculated betrayal of public trust. Facing overwhelming evidence, Byrd-Bennett pleaded guilty in 2015 to one count of wire fraud. In court, her once commanding voice trembled as she said, "I'm terribly sorry. I let down every student, parent, and teacher who trusted me." The judge wasn't moved. During sentencing, U.S. District Judge Edmund Chang called her actions a grave abuse of authority, noting how she used her position not to serve children, but to serve herself. He sentenced her to 4.5 years in federal prison. Solomon and Vranes also received prison terms, their company banned from future public contracts. The scandal's ripple effect reached deep into Chicago's education system, a system already under pressure from strikes, budget cuts, and declining trust. The damage wasn't just financial. Teachers and parents who once saw Byrd-Bennett as a symbol of progress felt personally deceived. "She didn't just steal money," one principal said. "She stole belief that someone in power could be clean." After serving her sentence, Byrd-Bennett retreated from public life. The U.S. Department of Education cited her case in new federal ethics guidelines for public administrators, warning how easily influence can twist into exploitation when oversight fails. Her downfall became a cautionary case study not only for educators, but for anyone who confuses authority with immunity. In the end, the woman who once preached integrity to Chicago's classrooms became a permanent reminder of what happens when leadership stops serving, learning, and starts serving greed. For nearly four decades, William James Vahey was everything a parent wanted in a teacher: charming, worldly, and seemingly devoted to his students. Born in the U.S. and raised partly overseas, Vahey taught at elite international schools across Venezuela, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Greece, Nicaragua, and the UK. Wherever he went, he earned glowing evaluations. Students remembered him as fun and fatherly. Administrators praised his commitment to cultural learning. But behind that mask of charisma, Vahey was committing one of the most systematic and far-reaching patterns of abuse ever discovered in international education. His method was meticulous. At school events, field trips, and sports excursions, Vahey would bake brownies laced with sleeping pills, a quiet ritual that allowed him to photograph and assault unconscious students. Many of his victims were between 11 and 14 years old. He kept everything organized: names, dates, and photos stored on encrypted drives that no one suspected existed. Vahey's career path mirrored a pattern of exploitation enabled by trust and mobility. International schools, desperate for experienced American educators, rarely questioned his credentials. Each new reference from a previous employer, often written out of politeness or ignorance, helped him move seamlessly from one continent to another. His last posting was at South Bank International School in London, where he taught history and coached sports. He had already built decades of access to young students. Parents saw him as a model expatriate teacher, kind, professional, devoted. No one asked about his past arrests, including a 1,969 conviction in the U.S. for child abuse. That conviction had been quietly erased from his employment records. It wasn't until March 2014, when Vahey's housekeeper in Nicaragua stole one of his flash drives, that his entire secret life began to unravel. The drive contained over 90,000 images, evidence of hundreds of assaults spanning multiple countries and decades. When confronted by his employer, Vahey didn't deny it. Instead, he confessed that he had been molesting boys for most of his career, an admission that left investigators speechless. Days later, before the full investigation could begin, Vahey took his own life in Minnesota. But death didn't end the scandal. It ignited a global manhunt of a different kind. Dozens of schools, from London to Jakarta, began issuing statements, apologizing to alumni, and cooperating with FBI and Interpol investigators. His victims, spread across continents, started coming forward. Some remembered flashes of confusion after eating brownies. Others only realized years later what had been done to them. In 2014, the FBI declared Vahey's crimes unique in scope and scale, a predator who had used the education system itself as his camouflage. They described his case as an international failure of due diligence. Every institution he touched, the American Nicaraguan School, Jakarta International School, South Bank International, and others, became symbols of a global blind spot. The assumption that teachers who move often must simply be adventurous, not escaping scrutiny. As one investigator later said, he found the perfect loophole: the world trusted its teachers, and the schools trusted each other. When William Vahey was found dead in Minnesota in March 2014, investigators uncovered only the first layer of a horror story that would span continents and decades. The FBI stepped in with an unprecedented global manhunt. A housekeeper at Vahey's classroom in Managua found a thumb drive full of images of unconscious boys. Those files were catalogued by date and location, matching Vahey's student field trips. The FBI found at least 90 confirmed child victim images and thousands more potential victims from the 1,972 through 2013. Because Vahey taught at American-style international schools in 9 countries: Venezuela, UK, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Greece, Iran, Spain, Lebanon. His access spanned some of the world's most elite campuses. The scandal triggered investigations not only in the US, but in London, Jakarta, Caracas, and beyond. Schools faced lawsuits, reputational destruction, and unprecedented pressure to reform. Investigators concluded that Vahey exploited systemic blind spots: poor background checks, transient staffing, lack of data sharing across nations and institutions. One FBI agent said they had never seen another case where an individual may have molested this many children over such a long period of time. The institutions that hired him often ignored red flags or lacked the framework to act, and in some cases, suppressed reports of minor complaints. Vahey's suicide spared a criminal trial, but it did not end accountability. In the months following his death, the FBI requested public assistance in identifying victims and witnesses. Schools that once hired him launched internal probes, and national education bodies around the globe tightened policies on teacher mobility, criminal history checks, and safeguarding overseas staff. The case sent a chilling signal to parents, students, and educators. The trusted teacher abroad might be exploiting trust, not serving it. In many countries, this triggered a broader reckoning about how international schools perceived as bastions of privilege and safety managed risk. One guardian said, "We sent our son there thinking he would see the world. We never imagined the world he'd see would be the last place we looked for danger." Malka Leifer's story begins in Melbourne, where she served as principal of the ultra-Orthodox Adass Israel School, a small, close-knit community that prided itself on moral purity. To parents, she seemed gentle and deeply religious. But behind the school's gates, several students later described a nightmare hidden beneath respectability. Between 2003 and 2007, Leifer allegedly manipulated, groomed, and assaulted teenage girls under her care, often under the guise of counseling and spiritual guidance. She made them believe obedience was holiness and silence was virtue. When whispers began circulating in 2008, the school's board didn't call police. Instead, they quietly bought her a ticket. Within 24 hours of the first complaint, Leifer was on a plane to Israel, her departure framed as a medical emergency. It was not. It was an escape. Back in Melbourne, victims including sisters Dassie Ehrlich, Ellie Sapper, and Nicole Meyer realized the woman who'd promised to protect them had vanished beyond the law. They went public, sparking outrage throughout Australia. Authorities issued warrants, and Victoria Police formally charged Leifer with more than 70 counts of sexual abuse. But each time extradition neared, Leifer's lawyers claimed she was too mentally ill to face trial. For years, Israel's courts accepted that claim. She lived freely in an Orthodox settlement near Jerusalem, shopping, traveling, attending community events, while medical panels delayed proceedings. Undercover investigators eventually filmed her moving normally, meeting neighbors, even attending prayer gatherings. The footage shattered the facade. In 2021, after 13 years of legal maneuvers, Leifer was finally extradited to Australia. Her arrival in handcuffs was hailed as a victory for survivors who had spent over a decade fighting a system that had protected her through bureaucracy and deference to religious institutions. One victim said at the airport press conference, "She thought she could run forever, but our voices followed her." The trial would finally begin in Melbourne in 2023, but before the courtroom opened, the case had already become a symbol of something larger: how communities can protect leaders at the expense of children, and how justice can be delayed not by law alone, but by fear of shame. Next comes Part 8, the long fight for extradition, the trial, and the moment when survivors finally heard the word they'd waited for since childhood: guilty. For over a decade, Malka Leifer's name became synonymous with delay, manipulation, and the long shadow of institutional protection. When she fled Australia in 2008, the move wasn't a chaotic escape, it was coordinated. The Adass Israel School Board quietly arranged her flight to Israel after the first allegations surfaced, sidestepping police and shielding her from scrutiny. While her students processed trauma, she was rebuilding a new life abroad. In Israel, Leifer claimed to suffer from severe mental illness that made her unfit to face extradition. The claim froze proceedings for years. Judges accepted medical reports suggesting she was delusional, while her defense argued she couldn't even understand the charges. But beneath that legal theater, private investigators were watching. They filmed her shopping, talking to neighbors, attending social events, moving freely without any visible impairment. The footage told a story her lawyers didn't want the court to see. She was faking it. The revelations sparked outrage across both countries. Australia's government filed repeated extradition requests, while survivor advocates launched petitions, protests, and campaigns demanding action. Among them were sisters Dassie Ehrlich, Ellie Sapper, and Nicole Meyer, Leifer's former students who became the face of the movement. They went from anonymous victims to public voices, challenging the silence that had once defined their community. Each media appearance chipped away at the protective wall surrounding their abuser. By 2018, Israel's Attorney General had seen enough. Leifer was declared mentally fit for trial, but her lawyers filed appeals, stalling her removal once again. Every delay deepened the wound for survivors, who watched the system twist in favor of the accused. "Every day she stays free is another day we relive it," one of them said. The extradition became not just a legal process, but a moral test for two nations, one demanding accountability, the other balancing law with internal politics. Finally, in January 2021, the waiting ended. Leifer was handcuffed, placed on a plane to Melbourne, and delivered into the custody of Australian Federal Police. Cameras caught her arrival. A woman once protected by religious institutions, now wearing a prison uniform. Her victims watched live coverage in tears the moment they had been told would never come. In 2023, after a lengthy trial, Leifer was convicted on 18 counts of sexual abuse and sentenced to 15 years in prison. As the judge read the verdict, survivors held hands in the courtroom. For them, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about recognition, a system finally naming what had been denied for too long. When Leifer was led away, Dassi Ehrlich spoke quietly to reporters. "Justice doesn't erase what happened, but it proves that no matter who you are or how long you hide, the truth can still find you." In the late 2000s, the district offices of Atlanta Public Schools, APS, resonated with filtered triumph. Test scores were soaring, graduation rates were climbing, and the administration led by Beverly Hall was celebrated across the country. She had been named National Superintendent of the Year, lauded for turning around a struggling urban school system. But underneath that polished victory lay a more troubling reality. A culture built on fear, artificial results, and unrelenting demands. At schools across the district, educators found themselves caught between two truths. On one hand, the message from the top was simple. Hits on standardized tests would determine careers, funding, and reputations. On the other hand, the targets became impossible. Teachers at one middle school recounted how math pass rates jumped from 24% to over 80% in a single year. Internally, suspicion grew. Erasures on answer sheets, wrong responses changed to right ones, and students who failed were suddenly flagged differently. Investigators later confirmed cheating in 44 of the 56 schools they examined and implicated 178 educators going back to 2001. The driving force wasn't individual misstep. It was an institution operating on the calculus of metrics over meaning. Schools that failed to hit targets were threatened with closure or staff replacement. Schools that succeeded were rewarded with bonuses and public praise. At APS, a whistleblower reported that principals told teachers bluntly that there would be no exceptions and no excuses for failure. Teachers were pressured, colleagues intimidated, and checklists tramped on the terrain of actual learning. In classrooms once dedicated to inquiry, the act of education was inverted. The question became not, "What have you learned?" but, "Did the numbers jump?" At stake were not only reputations, but entire careers, promotions, and media-celebrated reforms. When testers looked at the data, they found not natural progress, but spikes that defied plausible explanation. A forensic red flag of systematic problem. The result: a network of wrong answers corrected, reports shredded, whistleblowers sidelined, and the students, whose lives were supposed to benefit, caught in the web of institutional rot. What started as a promising model became, in effect, a test score machine until its machinery jammed and the gears came grinding down. When investigators finally laid out the evidence, Atlanta's reform miracle disintegrated into a courtroom reckoning. In 2013, a grand jury indicted 35 educators, from teachers to principals to the superintendent herself, under Georgia's Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was the first time in U.S. history that an entire public school district faced a RICO prosecution. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Laws once designed for mobsters were now being used against educators. At the center was Dr. Beverly Hall, the same superintendent who'd once been hailed as a national model of educational leadership. Prosecutors argued that Hall created a culture of fear and intimidation where success was the only option. Bonuses, promotions, and job security all hinged on inflated test results. Her lieutenants allegedly coordinated secret erasure parties, where answer sheets were corrected late into the night before being resubmitted to the state. Hall denied ordering anyone to cheat, insisting that the system she built had been hijacked by a few bad actors. But the RICO case told a different story, one of coordinated manipulation, top-down pressure, and calculated deceit. In court, teachers broke down in tears as they described being forced to choose between their conscience and their careers. One recalled being told, "If the scores don't rise, you'll be replaced." Another admitted she prayed for forgiveness each night after changing answers. The trial lasted 8 months. In April 2015, 11 defendants were found guilty on racketeering and related charges. Most received prison sentences ranging from 1 to 7 years. Beverly Hall herself never faced sentencing. She died of cancer before her trial could begin, but the damage to her legacy was irreversible. Her portrait, once displayed proudly in district offices, was quietly taken down. In the aftermath, Atlanta public schools became a national cautionary tale. Test results were recalibrated, leadership replaced, and the district placed under intense federal and state scrutiny. Parents and students struggled with the realization that years of achievement had been built on deception. The community that once cheered Hall's success now wrestled with betrayal, not just by individuals, but by an entire system that valued statistics over truth. Years later, some educators still defend the pressure they were under, calling it survival in a broken system. Others view the scandal as proof that when education turns into competition, integrity becomes collateral damage. The RICO convictions didn't just close a case, they exposed an uncomfortable truth. Corruption doesn't always look like greed. Sometimes it hides behind data charts, applause, and the illusion of progress. In the heart of Australia's Red Centre, in Alice Springs, the Yipirinya school stood as a beacon of hope for Indigenous education. A place where bush language met classroom learning, where kids from remote communities were told they belonged. Into that space walked Gavin Morris, a man given the title of principal, a title that carries trust, authority, and the responsibility to protect. From 2021 onward, staff recall that parents greeted Morris with optimism. The headmaster who championed community values, who spoke of cultural safety and two-way learning. But beneath that calm surface, something shifted. Soon enough, a pattern emerged that turned trust into trauma. From the playground to the classroom, pupils began whispering about being grabbed, hauled, and shamed. The man who held the badge of protector became the source of fear. One student, just 8 years old, testified later that he'd been dragged by his ears after spilling paint, an incident the court would hear as more than discipline. Another girl recounted being placed in a chokehold by Morris during class, her body trembling, the color draining before she fell silent. Staff described children who once loved school refusing to return. They heard the words Morris spoke. "You're worthless. You'll never learn." And worse, racial slurs that targeted Indigenous children in their own school. The culture of discipline in Yipirinya changed. No longer was correction based on education or care. It became something else, an assertion of dominance, dressed as order. Morris was praised publicly for his strictness, while privately the hallways echoed with fear. Teachers who raised concerns were often dismissed or ignored. Parents, entrusting their children to the school, began to feel like outsiders watching through a glass, powerless, anxious, uncertain. And yet for months, nothing happened. The reputation of the school, the charisma of its leader, the vulnerable children in his care, all aligned in a perfect storm of neglect. When the charges finally came in August 2024, they stunned the community. Morris was facing 5 counts of aggravated assault, In court in October 2025, he was found guilty on 4 of those counts, the proof unmasking a principal who abused the power given to him. The tragedy reminded the nation of a brutal truth. When a child enters a school, they hand over not just their afternoon hours, but their trust. And when that trust is betrayed, the wound doesn't heal with a sentence. It echoes through years of lost innocence, broken belief, and the question, who watches the watchers? Part 12, Trial, Sentencing, and National Outrage over Accountability. When the verdict came down, the community around Alice Springs understood that the harm wasn't just individual, it was systemic. Former Principal Gavin Morris of Yipirinya School was found guilty on 4 counts of aggravated assault after a judge-only trial heard how children as young as 8 were dragged by their ears, choked and subjected to racial slurs by someone entrusted with their care. In a courtroom where the public gallery sat silent, the judge declared that Morris's actions fell outside any plausible definition of discipline and that the children's testimony was credible and compelling. His use of force was ruled unjustified. His behavior was a betrayal of his role, and the school community felt that betrayal deeply. Sentencing, set for December, loomed as more than punishment. It was a reckoning. Indigenous families whose children attend the school felt the long-standing mistrust of institutions validated and angered. The Northern Territory's Department of Education announced a statutory manager would oversee the school's governance, following a report that uncovered scores of complaints, governance failures, and financial irregularities under Morris's leadership. National media spotlighted the case. A principal, once celebrated for championing Indigenous education, now became a symbol of vulnerability in the very environment meant to protect. Advocacy groups mobilized, demanding reforms in remote schools, stronger oversight of non-government institutions, and better mechanisms to ensure children are safe, not just taught. Parental confidence shook. Former students refused to return, citing the trauma inflicted by someone in authority. Questions multiplied. When a school leader becomes the threat, how can trust ever be rebuilt? How do institutions designed to empower instead end up oppressing? The school's current principal released a short statement acknowledging the pain, pledging change, and asking the community to help rebuild. But for many families, the promise felt thin. It doesn't erase the past. As Morris awaits final sentencing, the case continues to serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the badge of educator carries tremendous power, and that when that power is abused, the most sacred space of learning becomes a place of fear. In a small Delaware town, where everyone knows the local teachers by name and the school board meets at the same hall used for church gatherings, trust isn't just expected, it's assumed. That's what made the fall of Judith Brittingham so devastating. She wasn't an outsider. She was the principal who showed up at every fundraiser, smiled for every local paper photo, and talked endlessly about integrity in education. But beneath the surface, she was forging documents, falsifying payments, and quietly siphoning public funds from the very institution that trusted her most. The scheme began innocuously, tucked inside the district's own payroll system. Over several months, Brittingham approved overtime payments for a paraprofessional employee who never worked those hours. She signed off on mileage reimbursements that didn't exist, adjusted attendance records, and used her access to manipulate financial entries. Each act was small, unremarkable, until someone in the finance office noticed a pattern. Dozens of claims tied to the same employee, all approved by the same principal. When investigators reviewed the digital trail, they found over 100 falsified entries stretching back more than a year. The sums weren't enormous compared to big city scandals, but in a small district, every stolen dollar meant a book not bought, a program unfunded, a teacher left struggling to make ends meet. It wasn't just theft, it was betrayal wrapped in administrative routine. When confronted, Brittingham denied wrongdoing, calling it an accounting misunderstanding. But auditors uncovered direct approvals and falsified documents bearing her digital signature. Eventually, she turned herself in to state police, charged with forgery, theft, and official misconduct. For the town, it was a gut punch. The woman they'd trusted with their children's education had been using that trust to enrich herself. Parents who defended her were left speechless. "We thought she was one of the good ones," one parent said at the courthouse. "She stood in front of our kids and preached honesty. Turns out, she couldn't practice it herself." The state attorney called it a textbook example of small-town corruption, the kind that thrives on familiarity. There was no criminal empire, no grand conspiracy, just a respected educator who thought no one would look too closely. After her arrest, the district froze its reimbursement systems and launched a review of every expense logged under her tenure. Teachers whispered about how easily it could have gone unnoticed if not for a single clerk who refused to ignore a discrepancy. In towns like Sussex County, corruption doesn't wear a mask. It smiles at PTA meetings and hands out awards at graduation. That's why Brittingham's story hit harder than most. It wasn't about money. It was about what happens when authority and trust merge unchecked, when the person signing the report is also writing the lie. In Wilmington's tranquil suburban neighborhoods, trust is the currency of both homes and schools. When Tasha Purnell, previously known as Tasha Oliver, became principal of A.I. DuPont Middle School in 2020, she appeared to embody that trust, a seasoned educator, active in the community, presenting herself as a guide for young students. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a betrayal rooted in years of abuse, manipulation, and silence. Between 2010 and 2014, while working as a teacher at Stanton Middle School, Purnell engaged in repeated sexual exploitation of a student under the age of 16. The pattern was chilling. Years of grooming, behind closed doors, while the institution continued to elevate her. In 2023, she was placed on administrative leave, yet the public was largely kept in the dark for months. She remained on salary with a $142,000 paycheck, while investigations proceeded in secret. The gap between her professional image and her criminal acts grew wider with each passing day. When Purnell pleaded guilty in May 2025 to 2 counts of third-degree rape and 1 count of continuous sexual abuse of a child, the shock reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Parents questioned how a principal entrusted with leadership, discipline, and the welfare of children could carry hidden crimes through 2 schools over decades. Teachers spoke of her charm and calm demeanor. "She made everyone feel safe," one recalled. That feeling of safety was a facade that masked calculated abuse. The district's failure to notify families about her arrest added another layer of betrayal. Parents watched weekend news reports, learning the name of the principal once seen at every school function, now indicted for rape. Students questioned whether their school had been a place of support or one of concealment. Advocates said the case revealed not just one predator, but systems unprepared to protect children when authority became the threat. As sentencing looms, likely up to 8 years based on the plea agreement, the community faces a long path to healing. It's not just about a troubling individual case. It's about the broader lesson. Charm and authority do not equal safety. And until oversight is sharper than reputation, the most trusted corridors may hide the worst breaches of trust. In the quiet corridors of a Queensland Catholic school in the early 1982s, the figure of Desmond Bead Mackerel stood tall. A member of the De La Salle brothers, decorated for service in Papua New Guinea, and even awarded an OB. He wore his habit like armor. Respected, trusted, untouchable. Teachers deferred to him, colleagues admired him, and parents felt assured. He wasn't just a principal. He was a moral guardian, a role model. But decades later, after years of silence and hidden fear, that image shattered. A former student, now in his 40s, stepped forward, accusing Mackerel of repeated sexual conduct, with a child and 2 counts of carnal knowledge against the order of nature during Mackerel's tenure as headmaster. He described assaults in a school toilet cubicle, being held down during another teacher's crime, 4 strip-downs in an office. The man had been 13 to 15 years old at the time. Mackerel was his principal. The trial returned a verdict that stunned the institution. Mackerel was found guilty. The judge called his behavior vile. The jury confirmed his responsibility. At 90 years old, his reputation taken, Mackerel was sentenced to 7 years in prison eligibility for parole after serving half. He immediately appealed, but in August 2025, the Queensland Court of Appeal rejected his challenge and affirmed the conviction. The man once awarded for his educational service now wears the label of predator. What makes Mackerel's case so chilling is not simply that a powerful figure abused children, it's how the system enabled it. The school board kept his records spotless. The orders of the church kept his file hidden, and the community's silence bought him decades of impunity. His name once stood for discipline, devotion, and duty. Now it stands as a warning, because the real betrayal wasn't just the crimes themselves, it was the environment that allowed them to be concealed. When the verdict was read, one parent standing outside the court summed it up in a single, quiet sentence. "We trusted the badge. He just wore the collar." Part 16. When the classroom turned into a courtroom. Across continents, from Delaware to Queensland, one theme unites every story: power without accountability. The classroom, once imagined as a sanctuary for growth and trust, became a place where titles like principal, headmaster, and administrator carried more protection than scrutiny. These were not isolated crimes. They were the predictable result of systems that prized reputation over responsibility. In each case, the signs were visible. The polished educator who never tolerated questions. The culture that silenced complaints in the name of discipline. The bureaucracy that delayed action until headlines forced its hand. Whether the crimes were physical, financial, or psychological, the pattern was constant. Unchecked authority breeds impunity, and silence feeds corruption. The victims came from every corner: students too young to defend themselves, teachers afraid to speak out, parents convinced that institutions always know best. For years, they carried the consequences, while the perpetrators carried titles. When justice finally arrived, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation of something everyone feared, but no one wanted to admit that the very places built to shape the future had been quietly eroding it. Courtrooms replaced classrooms. Witnesses replaced students. Judges replaced principals. And each verdict became a grim reminder that the pursuit of education means nothing without ethics. The damage these figures caused wasn't only in stolen innocence or stolen money. It was in the erosion of faith itself. When a child stops believing their teacher can protect them, something sacred breaks. In the end, every scandal from falsified records to abuse hidden under clerical robes points to a single, devastating truth. Institutions do not fail overnight. They fail one ignored complaint at a time, one blind signature at a time, one misplaced trust at a time. Schools were built to protect the next generation. When their leaders became predators, the classroom itself became evidence. And in that evidence lies a collective lesson that trust without vigilance is the first step toward betrayal.